Okay, so we've considered some aspects around implicit and explicit learning. In this section, what we're going to focus on is some of the differences in the nature of explicit and implicit storage of memories. So specifically, we're going to differentiate between what's called declarative memories. So these are memories that can be declared, so you can say them out loud almost. An explicit memory that involves conscious recollection of information. So you have some kind of conscious awareness and access to these memories, as opposed to non-declarative memory, so memories that are implicit and do not involve conscious recollection of information. So again, there's a total overlap in terminology here, that when we're talking about declarative, that means the same essentially as explicit, and non-declarative is the same as implicit memories here. And if we look at a simple taxonomy of different memory systems here, so within long-term memory, we can split this into the declarative and the non-declarative or procedural. So stuff that fits in that declarative section is things you know that you can tell other people. So these can be episodic memories, so remembering the first day that you go to school, or semantic memory, so knowing the capital of France. We'll also, throughout this course, dig into a specific form of episodic memory. So we have autobiographical memories, which are stories and events that particularly describe ourselves. So we're an agent in those stories, and they become quite important for understanding who we are as individuals. Now on the other side, we've got these non-declarative or procedural memories. So things you know that you can show by doing. So we can't necessarily articulate them well. One of these is kind of skill learning effects. So the ability of knowing how to ride a bicycle. There's also priming effects. So this ability to be more likely to use a word that you heard recently. So if I ask you something you ride with two wheels is most of you, given that I've just mentioned a bicycle, the natural thing that will pop in your head is something you ride with two wheels is a bicycle. You could answer a scooter, many other things. I'm not sure how many other things there are with two wheels. There are other things that could put in there. And there's also conditioning effects. So classical conditioning is an example of a non-declarative memory. So we use episodic memories to remember past events, so experiences and episodes basically. And for something to be an episodic memory, it typically has to fulfill this 3W criteria. So it has to explain what happened, where it happened, and when it happened. So for example, your memory of what you were doing at the weekend is going to be largely episodic. And naively, we might expect that these sorts of episodic memories are almost like a kind of video recording of the experience. However, I hope by now, one of the things that you should be starting to realize is that we don't always typically store memories in a kind of truly faithful representation. That's not necessarily how our brain operates. So our episodic memories are definitely not like a photographic or a movie-like representation of past experience. They tend to work more like a constructive process. And we'll come on in the subsequent weeks to identify some of the ways that these episodic memories are prone to errors and misremembering. And there's some good reasons why we don't store everything in perfect detail. And the first of these, and probably the most important, is that it will just be way too memory intensive. So if you imagine, just a simple example, like if you take your phone, you turn on the video, and you turn it on at the start of a Saturday, and you try and record everything that happens over that weekend, what's going to happen? And you should find after a few hours of recording stuff, and particularly on a sort of high definition mode, the memory card that's in there is going to fill up. You're going to run out of space to record stuff. And in a similar way to that, if we're thinking that we as humans could record and store every single bit of information that we see around us, even if you take away the boring bits, it's still going to be beyond what would be reasonable to accurately store anywhere. So instead, what is probably more likely to represent our storage of episodic memories is like taking a series of kind of detailed snapshots at key moments, and we use the same processes that are involved in imagery to reconstruct these episodic memories that we have. So our episodic memory system is not some kind of static process of us being able to record every single piece of detail and then simply accessing this stored information. Rather, what seems to be happening is that we're much more likely to store key details, and then when we're trying to recall that episodic memory, we're actually reconstructing these memories based on this incomplete information. And the episodic memory system is argued to be kind of fundamental for this reconstruction ability. And this is somewhat supported by evidence that patients with impaired episodic memory, so in other words, we're looking at patients with amnesia, they also have impaired ability to imagine future events. So a nice study by Hassabis et al. Took 5 amnesic patients and 10 healthy controls and asked them to imagine several different experiences. So lying on a white sandy beach or standing in the main hall of a museum containing many exhibits. And the goal for them was just to describe and imagine that experience in as much detail as possible. And you get very strong effects that occurred that the patient, so if we look at an example at the top here, P03 is patient 3. As for seeing, I can't really, apart from just sky. I can hear the sound of seagulls and of the sea. I can feel the grains of sand between my fingers. I can hear one of those ships' hooters. That's about it. And then the researcher would ask, are you actually seeing this in your mind's eye? No, the only thing I can see is blue. So if you look around, what can you see? Really all I can see is the colour of the blue sky and the white sand. The rest of it, the sounds and things, obviously I'm just hearing. And they're like, no, it's kind of just sort of floating. Whereas for a healthy control participant that's doing this, they would describe it as like, it's hot, the sun's beating down, the sound underneath me is almost unbearably hot, I can hear the sounds of small wavelets lapping on the beach, the sea is a gorgeous aquamarine colour, etc. So there's a real kind of richness of detail here. And on the right hand side you can see plotted here is something they refer to as the experiential index. So in other words, how much during this imagery does it seem like they are creating a kind of rich and vivid experience. And you get high scores for the controls, and generally the patients with amnesia that have episodic memory deficits, their ability is very poor. There's one patient who's a kind of outlier that does have pretty intact imaginary ability. So in other words, there's a strong overlap between imagery and episodic memories, and this suggestion that the episodic memory system is fundamentally a kind of a reconstruction and almost like a imagination system that is just using key bits of past information to reconstruct those previous memories and events that have happened to us. So how do you go about assessing episodic memory? And we can do this in a number of different ways, but one of the most popular is simply a test of recognition memory. And recognition memory involves deciding whether a given stimulus was previously encountered. And this may involve familiarity or actual recollection. So familiarity is essentially a much easier version. It's just you being confident that you recognize something before. Whereas recollection is being able to piece together the information of the context in which you encountered this information. So for example, if you imagine that you're in the cinema and you're sat there with some popcorn, you've got some Coke in your hand, and the film starts, and then you see an actor that comes on the screen, and you turn to your friends and you say to them like, well, I know that actor from somewhere, where do I know him from, what's he been in before? And the appropriate response should be shut up, just watch the film. But there might be some point later on that it suddenly comes to you that, this person was in that film, that's where I know him from. The first one, I know this person, I know him from somewhere, that is familiarity. The second one, knowing exactly where you've seen them before, that is recollection. And typically, one of the ways that you could assess this distinction is using a task known as Tolving's remember know task. And put really simply, participants in this task, they just simply indicate whether their recognition responses is based on familiarity or recollection. And not surprisingly, if we're thinking of the fact that this recollection requires combining information about the context of where you heard this information, it's more complicated. So it's much more complicated than familiarity. So we've got to bind together the information about what something is with where. Where was it that you saw this information? Whereas in contrast, the familiarity, to know that you kind of recognize somebody, that just requires the kind of what piece of information. It doesn't require the sort of binding together of these two bits. And there's evidence that this kind of binding of information requires integrity of the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe. Now, evidence for this comes from a review paper by Skinner and Fernandez. So they reviewed all the studies that were published of amnesic patients that either had damage that involved the medial temporal lobe and the hippocampus, or they were amnesic patients that had damage to different brain regions. So one of the things we can focus on here is if we first of all look at the dark black bars are indicating performance of our healthy control participants. So they have much better performance on both the recollection or the familiarity tasks. Now the interesting bit here is if we look at the right hand side for our brain damage patients, they have equivalent performance on the familiarity task, whether they've had damage to the medial temporal lobe or non-medial temporal lobe lesions. The interesting bit then is how does performance reduce on the recollection task? And we see this really big drop off in performance for medial temporal lobe lesion patients, suggesting that this medial temporal lobe is kind of critical for this recollection ability, and therefore critical for this sort of binding of the sort of what where information that's presenting here. Okay, we're going to switch our attention to semantic memory, and to illustrate semantic memory, try and answer the following three questions. So what is this, where is this, and who is this? Now for most of you, you should find without too much difficulty, you realise the first one's a Dalmatian or a dog. You see the skyscraper, maybe you recognise that this is of London, and then who is this is Angelina Jolie. And for most people, you can answer those questions without necessarily needing to think too much. And we do this effortlessly because we hold this incredible amount of knowledge that we often just simply take for granted. And this organised general knowledge we have about the world is referred to as semantic memory. And there's a lot of similarities that exist between semantic and episodic memories, and the former is often required in the latter. So anytime that we're recalling episodic memory, we typically need information, so semantic information about the things that we're discussing or describing. So for example, if I was to recall an episodic memory of moving house, it's episodic because it involves recalling a specific event in a specific location. However, I need semantic memory because a lot of what I'm going to be remembering, so picking up a particular box, moving it to a certain room, I need semantic memories of what a box is, what a bedroom typically looks like, etc. And Tolving attempted to clarify the distinction between episodic and semantic memory by arguing that episodic memory is just simply a kind of more fragile or more recent evolution of semantic memory. And And some of the evidence that comes in support of this is the fact that when you look at the deficits that occur in patients with amnesia, so these are impairments, extensive impairments of long-term memory. Typically, the impairments tend to extend to being most severe for episodic memories as opposed to semantic memories. There's obviously counterexamples and distinctions for this, but on average, most of the time, you're going to have much more severe ability in recalling events as opposed to recalling your knowledge of general everyday objects, etc. As always, we can learn a lot of information about the distinctions of different cognitive systems, so in this case our different memory systems, by turning our attention to patients with brain damage. So in this case we're going to look at what can we learn from patients with amnesia. So amnesia is kind of classified or defined as an individual that has a severe deficit with long-term memory. And this can manifest in different ways. So it can form in a kind of retrograde fashion where individuals have a lot of difficulty retrieving past memories, or anterograde amnesia, where you have problems forming new long-term memories. So the causes of amnesia, there's sort of three distinct causes that can lead to this. Common one is through trauma. So where you've had a closed head injury, so some traumatic brain damage. It can also arise through biological causes. So you can have encephalitis, so through a disease that targets the hippocampal region. There's also through chronic alcohol abuse. So this is typically known as Korsakoff's syndrome. It's not actually the alcohol that leads to the amnesia directly. It's more of an indirect effect through poor nutrition of alcoholics that they then end up with a deficiency in vitamin B1, and it's this that leads to the amnesia symptoms. You can also have an extreme emotional shock. So if you go through a very traumatic event, there's also instances where that can lead to what's known as a kind of psychogenic amnesia. What is amnesia not? It is not like a lot of the portrayals in the movies. So there are some very accurate depictions out there. I think Memento is a very good one. But a lot of the instances where you come across amnesia in the movies, many of the times it would be typically displayed as you've got this retrograde amnesia where they can't retrieve any past memories, with the current ability to form memories is always intact, which is often not the case. So we often see instances of, certainly in the early stages of recovery, there's still issues with, for most patients of traumatic brain injuries, there's still instances of anterograde amnesia that occurs there. I think one thing that often in a lot of these movies is that you get this kind of two head injuries are better than one effect, where one of the most common cures for amnesic syndrome is to get like a second bump to the head. So if you get one injury and it turns it on, you get another one, it's going to turn off your amnesia, which just does not happen. And in most film memories, the memories are not lost, they're just sort of made temporarily accessible, and then you might have recovery of these memories through some sort of unlikely process. So just to put this into kind of graphical form, is look at these difference of the retrograde and anterograde amnesia. So we look at the point here, we've got a time point of the brain injury. These lost memories that would occur in retrograde amnesia is not necessarily everything in the past. It's usually those things in the near past. And again, this could be a matter of weeks, months, or years. Whereas memories that are formed a long time ago are generally preserved. Those are typically, even in retrograde amnesia, quite hard to interfere with. And then anterograde amnesia is this inability to form new long-term declarative or explicit memories. And you get a little bit of a difference here that the medial temporal lobe is involved in both of them, but damage to the medial diencephalon seems to be important for leading to anterograde amnesia. So in the clip that you should have watched, you would have seen a nice summary here of the patient HM and what research has been done on his memory problems and how that's contributed to our understanding of human memory, and particularly the distinction that's then made between short-term and long-term memory systems. So for this patient, I think the key things to pick out is that he had the removal of the hippocampus here, lost many of his kind of past memories, also unable to form any new long-term memories, certainly explicit ones. He was able to retain memories using rehearsal or short-term memory. So if he was allowed and had the space to kind of repeat and hold things in short-term memory, he could develop strategies to hold that briefly. And it provides evidence for this distinction in implicit learning. So you found cases where he was able to engage in procedural learning and learn implicit skills without being able to learn any new declarative memories. Similarly, with Clive Waring, he's a classic example of anterograde amnesia. So this documentary that it comes from is often referred to as the man with the 7-second memory. And he was a patient that had encephalitis infection to the brain that destroyed his hippocampus. And it's a pretty tragic illustration of someone who could remember practically nothing of his daily activities, or many of the sort of names of his children and what they were doing and what they were up to. And there's many poignant moments in that video where his wife would come into the room and he behaves as if he hasn't seen her for a really long period of time. And that's just his daily life. Every time that she leaves the room and comes back in, he's responding in exactly the same way. So, what is impaired? Now, in most amnesia patients, the main form of memory impairment is this inability to form new episodic memories. And much of this problem seems to stem from the fragility of their newly formed memories. So in other words, whatever memories they're currently holding in short-term memory and trying to transfer into a more permanent, stable long-term memory, this just seems to get disrupted and disturbed very quickly. So one of the ways that you can see this is if you actually give amnesic patients the opportunity to remove any interference, then they actually can be capable of retaining information longer than you would expect. So typically the research to study their memory deficits would involve asking them to recall a story that they've been told after 10 minutes. And if you tell an amnesic patient the story, and then you interact with them, and 10 minutes later you ask them to retell it, typical result is they're not going to be able to tell you anything, any details, that it will be a blank. However, if you get the patient to sit quietly in a dark, empty room, so there's no distraction, there's no interference, and they can rehearse and remember details of this, they are capable of recalling this story pretty well a lot of the time. So it suggests here that we've got an issue with the fragility of the memory rather than necessarily a complete inability to transfer this memory to long-term memory. So what is intact? And again, in most amnesic patients, generally this non-declarative memory, so our implicit procedural memory, is very rarely impaired. So we'll see procedural abilities. They'll be able to play their musical instruments. So you can see someone playing the piano. They'd still be able to ride a bike, etc. And they're also capable of learning these implicit skills as well. They're generally better, or in some cases very capable, of forming new semantic memories. So if you tell them a fact about something, they're more likely to be able to recall this than if you told them a story or asked them to recall a specific event that had happened. Now, that's not always the case. So there are some patients who have more severe problems with semantic memory too. And again, this is simply because we have overlap in the regions that are responsible for episodic memories, which is in the hippocampus, and regions that are responsible for semantic memories. And again, this is a bit more distributed and associated with adjacent areas of the medial temporal lobe. Now, why does amnesia occur? What's going on in a kind of mechanism that means people aren't able to store these episodic memories? And the traditional perspective of amnesia is that it provides strong evidence for these two distinct memory systems. So we've got one memory system that reflects declarative memory, and one memory system that is really impaired, and we've got another memory system that reflects non-declarative memory, and this one is kind of generally left intact. So traditional argument is that this amnesia is just really knocking out the declarative memory system. However, there's an alternative theoretical approach, which is often referred to as this binding hypothesis, and that suggests instead that the actual primary deficit in amnesia is the inability to form associations between two concepts. So in other words, to bind different pieces of information together. So in one test of this sort of binding hypothesis, which is actually also known as relational memory in some other terms, but same thing. In one study to test this done by Ryan et al., they asked participants to study and learn different visual scenes. So in this example here, you've got a scene of a bridge, and there's a girl that's just walked across the bridge. After presenting participants with these scenes for one exposure, they would then run a test phase where they present these images again, and participants have to indicate if the scene that they're seeing is a scene that they've previously learned, so if they've previously been exposed to. Now, the critical test of what they did in here was that in some of these images, so some of the scenes that they presented, they would be manipulated in some small way. So for example, what we've got on the image here is the original one presents the girl that's just walked over the bridge, and then you might be presented with a manipulated version where the girl has been photoshopped out of that image here. So sometimes the image would be the same, other times they would be novel, that they've never seen before, and then other times they would be manipulated, so one feature of the original scene is missing. Now, they then measured the eye fixations as participants viewed these scenes for the second time. And especially what they were interested in here was the amount of time a person fixated on this critical region. So in other words, where part of the scene had been altered in the manipulated condition. So in the example here, in this blue box, this would be the location of where the girl appeared in the original study. And what they found was that the healthy controls had much more eye movements to these regions, regardless of whether they were actually aware or unaware of the change having occurred. So what that's indicating is that there is some implicit memory, there's some implicit knowledge that they have that there was an object in that region and I need to direct my attention towards it. So they're storing some kind of implicit knowledge of the relations between the different items in this visual scene. So in other words, they knew something was located in that position of the scene relative to the other details. In contrast, the amnesic patients were just pretty terrible at doing this. So when there was a small manipulation to the scene, they didn't direct their attention to this critical region. So it suggests that it is requiring implicit memory to be able to do this. You don't need explicit awareness that you know that this image is manipulated. So it's relying on implicit memory, which we think, according to these kind of dual system approach, we think that amnesic patients would be good at a task that involves implicit memory, but it suggests that they're not very good at it. And the argument here is the reason they're not very good is that this implicit memory relies on our knowledge of being able to bind together the association between the different objects in the visual scene here. And really, that is the impairment in amnesia.